welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you very much for coming. You all know Rory Stewart, of course, that's why you're here, but just let me summarise. Born in Hong Kong, raised in Malaysia and Scotland and elsewhere, educated at Eton, Oxford, Black Watch, British Foreign Office, served in the Balkans, among other places, walked 6,000 miles from Turkey to Bangladesh, mostly across Afghanistan, one of the most effective prose stylist, I think, of his generation, written 2 sensationally good books, and he's only 36, which is the main reason I dislike him. He's had an extraordinary career, has achieved an amazing public profile, and those books, if you haven't had a chance to read them yet, I recommend highly. And served, of course, as an administrator in Iraq. Is that... Oh, that... Oh, whoa. Anybody who think I've never used a microphone before? Rory, I'm going to ask you to talk for 10 or 12 minutes, first of all, just to make your observations to us. Then I'll ask you a couple of questions. But the most exciting thing about being here is that we get to have a dialogue involving all of us. So I'll throw it open to you as soon as possible after that. Rory, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. I feel a little bit like I'm some kind of Jonathan Ross show sitting on the brown leather chair. So I'm gonna stand up just for 10 minutes because otherwise I can't see you. And to follow on from what Alan was saying, I'm very much hoping this is a conversation. There are people in the audience who know a great deal about Afghanistan. There are people in the audience who certainly know more about Afghanistan than I do, so I'm looking forward to that conversation. I'm going to begin, though, by posing a question, which is, what does the British government believe that it is doing? What is our foreign policy? Does Gordon Brown have a foreign policy? Does David Cameron have a foreign policy? The United States appears to have a foreign policy. President Obama currently is going through a strategic review in which various dignitaries, chief amongst whom is Richard Holbrooke, the new super envoy for Afghanistan, and they are going to review which will eventually conclude what they should be doing in that country. Somewhat peculiarly, in the course of the review, in fact, at the 20-day stage of the 60-day review process, they decided to deploy 17,000 more troops into Afghanistan. Quite sure how that ties into the whole notion of a strategic review. You just deploy the troops, and then you have a sort of think about whether or not that's a good idea afterwards. But nevertheless, there's something going on there. Whereas we seem, as far as I can gather, to be waiting for what the Obama administration may decide, and then we're just going to jump in behind them. I don't get a real sense, and I'd like people to come back at me if you disagree with me, that we're actually trying to influence this process or have a very clear idea of what our strategic objectives are. Or, to simplify, we lack a clear sense of how much it's going to cost us in terms of troops and lives, what the chances of success might be, and most importantly of all, what the goal is. If we're playing poker, normally you know the answers to those things. You know how much is on the table, how much you've got to bet to play, and what the chances of winning are. That's how you play. And that's normally what a strategy is about, but it's not something that I get the impression the British government has really developed. In order to analyse these things, I would suggest very simply that we need to take a serious look at the limits of our power, the limits of our knowledge, and the most importantly of all, the limits of our legitimacy. Since 2005, there has been a growing sense that what was lacking in Afghanistan was resources. There was a story that we had been distracted by Iraq. And this, of course, is a very attractive story because it allows you to criticize George Bush for something else, right? George Bush is not only all the things that we think George Bush is, but he's also destroyed Afghanistan by distracting us towards Iraq. And the theory there, presumably, was something along the lines of, had we been able to deploy all the billions of dollars that was spent in Iraq, and had we been able to deploy the 150,000 troops deployed in Iraq, things would be substantially better in Afghanistan. And you could see this argument beginning in 2004, 2005, when policy journals began to compare investment in Afghanistan to per capita investment in Bosnia or Kosovo. So you could have made another argument. You could have said, indeed you could say today, that the United States is spending twice as much in Afghanistan as it's spending in the whole of Latin America. It's a huge amount of investment into Afghanistan. Or you could say, by comparing it to very small populations such as those in the Balkans, that we're spending less than a quarter or a fifth of what we spent in the Balkans. And the question I suppose I want to pose or discuss with you is, was that analysis correct? I mean, do we have real reason to believe that the problem was that we had a light footprint, and had we instead had a heavier footprint, everything would have been fine? And leading on from that is to examine some of the kind of jargon that we use in describing what we might have done with more money and more troops, which is to say, this will be familiar to many of you, the comprehensive approach whereby we were supposed to reconcile economic development, security, and defense. Economic development, security, and diplomacy. Or the regional solution whereby we were meant to get Pakistan or Iran to get involved in the process. Or the negotiation with the Taliban whereby we were meant to separate off moderate Taliban elements. Now, clearly there's nothing wrong with any of those things. I mean, it doesn't seem prima facie that the notion of better coordination between different elements of government, or involving powerful neighbors in the process, or separating the moderate elements, the Taliban, away from the Taliban, are prima facie bad things. The question is, how on earth are we supposed to achieve them? And has Richard Holbrooke, or our current hero, General Petraeus, got any further towards doing so? And I'm finishing with General Petraeus because, of course, it is he who has come to epitomize the notion of the surge. Now, indeed, we are reassured that General Petraeus is such an astonishingly sophisticated and intelligent man with his Princeton doctorate that he would never confuse Iraq with Afghanistan, that he is fully aware of the differences between these two countries, and that if it appears on the surface as though he increased troops in Iraq in the belief that that would solve the situation in Iraq, and is now increasing troops in Afghanistan on a similar theory, that is purely coincidental. Right, the means may be the same, but the end may be entirely different, because he has a much more nuanced and sophisticated picture of Afghanistan. What exactly this picture is not clear. Two kinds of narratives are presented. One of them is clear, hold, build. Right, the story is you go into an Afghan town, you clear out the Taliban, you stop them from coming back in again, and then you allow the indigenous forces of economic development and governance to flourish. You train up the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police, and you leave. It's a clear whole build. The second view, which is slightly more cynical, is that General Petraeus doesn't think he can do that. That in fact what General Petraeus is trying to do is to whack the Taliban hard, because he doesn't think they'll come to the negotiating table at the moment because they don't have any reason to negotiate. So that the theory is really the same theory that Henry Kissinger had in 1968 in relation to Vietnam. In other words, you increase the number of troops, you whack the Viet Cong come to the table in Paris, and although they take over the country, eventually they do so in a fashion that's much more palatable to us, right? Which of these two theories General Petraeus is pursuing, I'm not clear, but I was in Baghdad last week, and I am very struck by the differences between the two situations. In Baghdad, my sense is that the Sunni tribal groups were really parts of Saddam's government. He had a very strong organic connection between the central state, the Ba'athist state, and these tribal chiefs. They were accustomed to dealing with the central government. They were fighting primarily because they were worried they were going to be living in a Shia Ayatollah super state. And they wanted to ensure that the Sunni had a strong and powerful voice in that state. They fought, and by and large, they achieved to some extent their goals, because they were able in 2006 to say, enough already, arm us, 85,000 people, guns, power, we'll run these areas, we'll turn away from al-Qaeda, and in the face of opposition from the Shia government, they managed broadly to achieve those things. So those Sunni tribal groups are quite different from the Afghan tribal groups. Different in a number of ways. One of them is that Afghan tribal groups, insofar as they continue to exist in southern Afghanistan and haven't been destroyed, firstly by the communists and then by the Jihad, are tribal groups in a more traditional sense. Their relationship to the central state is very, very uncertain. They're not actually artificial instruments of the central state. If anything, their very existence, models, and modes of life question the validity or the legitimacy of the central state. Secondly, it's far from clear that they're coming to us in any way at all. They're not coming and saying, give us guns, give us money, we'll take on the Taliban. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, the difference lies not so much just in the enemy, in the insurgents, but in the government itself. Al-Maliki's government is backed by a mass political process. You go to any Iraqi town in southern Iraq and you say, who's in charge? And pretty soon you come across somebody who's wearing a shirt buttoned up to the collar with no tie, who presents themselves as the head of Dawah, or the head of the Majlis Ahla, or the head of the Sadarin. And in every case, these are people who can mobilize 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 people in the streets with huge banners. In Afghanistan, there are no street demonstrations because there are none of these political parties. These politicians do not exist. You go to an Afghan town, you say who's in charge, and you're probably dealing with 6 or 7 people who might or might not include a balance of power between a local tribal chief, a mullah, a malik, a jihadi commander, and maybe a police chief or a sub-district governor. But there are no mass political parties, and Karzai's government has none of that depth or legitimacy which allows eventually al-Maliki to cut a deal with the Sunni tribal groups. For these reasons, when we talk about bringing the Taliban to the table, I question, to fall back on Descartes, whether there is a table at all. Now over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Of those two options, take, hold, build, and the whack the Taliban so hard that they have to do a deal, is either of those two options achievable? Are either of those two approaches winnable in your view?
I think the answer is I don't think either of those approaches are achievable. I have no reason to believe that we have the capacity, the competence to do those things. I think the Afghan security forces, despite improvements in the army, are not up to the job. I think we, as the international community, don't really know very much about rural Afghanistan. I don't think the military is likely to be able to clear, hold, build. Let's start with that, because even if they succeed in clearing, they will be clearing district towns. I mean, if you look at what the British have achieved with, let's say, 7,000 troops in Helmand, which is, in effect, 4 district towns. In effect, they control Musakala, Sangin, Goreshk, and Lashkargah. Outside, they don't control anything. If you were to bring what General Petraeus has done, which is 3 times that number, I would imagine you might be able to, I mean, this is, of course, slightly ludicrous mathematics, but for the sake of argument, you would be able to control 12 district towns and not much of the regional countryside around. Most importantly of all, however, having cleared and held, how on earth does the building happen? Because the assumption that there somehow is this thing called sustainable economic development or sustainable legitimate economic development in Afghanistan, or good governance in Afghanistan, or that this is going to emerge in any kind of realistic time frame seems to be questionable. Right? This country is a wonderful country. I mean, it's got extraordinary, strange individual natural resources. It's got a very entrepreneurial, dynamic local population. It's a very beautiful landscape. It's got a strong historical culture, but 80% of people cannot read or write. It's one of the probably 3 or 4 poorest countries in the world. It's right down there with Chad and Niger in the UN Human Development Index. In schools, perhaps 50% of teachers are educated 1 grade above their students. Most civil servants don't have a high school education. There's no infrastructure. There are no ports. It's not likely that Afghanistan, therefore, is going to be able to compete with India or China in the international export markets. And to bring it closer to home, those of you in the audience who come from Pakistan will appreciate immediately, but I'm not sure that American or British politicians appreciate so intuitively. Afghanistan would take at least 20 years, probably much longer, before it began to achieve the kind of levels that we see in Pakistan, right? Invest in Afghanistan for 20 years before the police, the army, the judiciary, the civil service began to resemble those in Pakistan. And yet Pakistan is not a stable country, right? Anything but, as we've just discovered in SWAT. So what exactly is the model then of this clear, hold, build? Presumably you create the space, you hold that ring, and you wait for something to bubble up inside. But it doesn't seem to me that what's likely to bubble up inside is going to be anything that's going to achieve any of your long-term strategic objectives, which brings us to the Taliban. And my answer to that, again, is that this is not the Viet Cong, right? The Taliban are a very fragile, fragmentary, curious, elusive group that I certainly don't understand, and I'm not sure many of us have a very clear view of. But I'm pretty clear that Mullah Muhammad Omar is not looking to come to the table, and that we don't have the carrots and sticks sufficient to drive him to that table. By and large, therefore, a counterinsurgency policy, full stop, in Afghanistan is a waste of time. We are not going to defeat the insurgency, however many troops we deploy, and that if we're going to keep soldiers in the country at all, we need to be thinking in a very, very different direction. Back to Alan.
You're open to the charge, aren't you, that what you're offering is a council of despair? Do you think you are?
No. But that's right. I mean, this is why this conversation is interesting. I am feeling increasingly defensive and beleaguered, because indeed it does sound like a council of despair. And it's very easy to think that what I'm saying is, let's abandon Afghanistan, let's not cut and run, let's just run. Right? That isn't actually what I believe. I run an urban regeneration project in Kabul. I have raised $24 million and invested it in that part of the old city. I have 350 staff, and I wouldn't be doing that if I believed Afghanistan was a hopeless basket case where it would be impossible to do anything. But I have observed since 2005, and this is really the history to try to explain where I'm coming from, I've observed us increase from 20,000 to 71,000 and now up to nearly 90,000 troops for no reason that makes any sense to me at all. The light footprint which Lakhdar Brahimi put in place in 2002 was imperfect, did not achieve all the things that we might have dreamt of achieving, but it was okay, I reckoned. Because I think Brahimi perceived, he was the UNSRSG, the UN head at that period. Brahimi at that period, he is a North African, comes from an anti-colonial past. He had seen in Kosovo many of the problems of a heavy international footprint, and I think he anticipated many of the ways in which deploying too many troops and too much money into the country would have perverse effects, would create a backlash of different sorts. The most important backlash that I'm worried about in Afghanistan is that by continually increasing the demand for troops and money, we make it more likely that we'll leave. We actually make it more likely that we're going to put in $45 billion this year and nothing the next year, because European governments, American voters, will increasingly become alienated by the waste, by the sense that we're not making any progress, probably produce a backlash from many conservative push to communities, and we will find ourselves running out the door, which is almost precisely what Afghanistan does not need. Afghanistan does not need electroshock therapy. It doesn't need a, here you are. Here is Bing West, currently, American Assistant Secretary of State, ex-Assistant Secretary of State, calling for $145 billion a year over 10 years, and then we're done. It's exactly what Afghanistan doesn't need. Right? What Afghanistan needs is a patient, tolerant, long-term relationship with the international community over 20 or 30 years in which we focus on the kind of things we can do, right? And this is perhaps the best way of answering Alan's question. In the Paris conference last year, and some of you may have participated in the Paris conference, basically the international community said, we've had some successes and we've had some challenges, right? I'm not quite sure why the opposite of successes is challenges. But anyway, that's what we said in the Paris conference. The successes turned out to be health, education, millions more children back in school, the central bank, the telecoms sector, training the Afghan National Army, rural development through something called the National Solidarity Program. And these things are, by and large, pretty successful. I mean, it is true there are 3 million more children back in school, most of whom are girls. It is true the National Solidarity Program, for all its problems, is delivering $20,000 to villages. And the challenges, on the other hand, are the police, rule of law, the judiciary, corruption, all the issues around governance, state building, counter-narcotics, counter-insurgency. The international community broadly decided in Paris that the logical answer was to take all the money out of the successes and put it all into the challenges. That the reason why the challenges were challenges is we just hadn't concentrated hard enough on them. You could also do the same geographically. Central and the north, quite prosperous, quite stable, doing quite well. V-Day, the answer is to put all the investment into the unstable areas of the south and the east. My instinct would be pretty much the reverse. My instinct would be to say foreign policy is difficult. There are many reasons why we can't make much progress in Afghanistan. Afghans are suspicious and hostile towards us because they see we're claiming to spend $4 billion a year in international aid, and they can't see much result for it. So let's concentrate on the things that we have done well, and let's work with those areas in the central north that want to work with us. Instead of what we've actually done, we've put 20 times more investment into Panjai, a single sub-district south of Kandahar, as we put into the whole of Resurgent with 3 million people. And yet Resurgent is doing much better because the people in Resurgent are prepared to provide their labor for free, their materials for free, the security is better, and they're prepared to work with us. So I certainly wouldn't give up and cut and run. I believe that with a light footprint, you can help a country like Afghanistan. I don't think it's an either-or affair. One of the things I hate about this is this black and white tendency to somehow suggest that reducing to, for the sake of argument, 10,000 troops and $2 billion a year in international aid would be the same as running away and would return Afghanistan to the civil war of the early 1990s. Why on earth do we think that? 10,000 troops, even 10,000 troops in a country is a colossal presence. Right? Even $2 or $3 billion of international aid is a colossal presence. On the basis of the way in which we normally deal in relation to our national priorities, our strategy, our interests with Nepal, Somalia, Chad, that is a very significant investment, and I am pretty confident that we could do something with it, and probably actually, we would end up doing more with that over 30 years than we would trying to pump in ludicrous amount of resources in the short term and then leaving.
So if Barack Obama and Richard Holbrooke were in this room, you would say to them, draw down the troops to 10,000 over the next year or two, do less, do it better, concentrate on the successes, abandon the failures, and that's how you start this 30-year period of engagement.
90%, yep. I probably wouldn't specify troop numbers. I'm not a general. But I'd probably start the conversation with the military by saying, what could you do with, let's say, 10,000 troops, 20,000 troops, I don't know. Explain to them that the political will, the commitment, is not there to indefinitely preserve 100,000 troops on the ground in the country. Just ask them what they can do with that.
But doesn't this mean abandoning whole territory, whole regions of the country to the Taliban?
Yes. Yeah, in effect it does, because in effect it recognizes that we, at the moment, do not control most of those areas outside the cities, and we are not likely to have the resources to ever be able to control them. Is that the end of the country? No. But the solution to that problem, I don't think, lies with the deployment of more troops. It lies with Afghan leadership. In other words, I think it's perfectly possible that you could pacify those areas. It's perfectly possible you could work in those areas. But the way in which you'd probably do it, if you were the president, is to go, for example, to Paktia and sit down and try to identify who the most powerful, effective, representative figures are in Paktia, work out what on earth they're complaining about, and work out what you can offer them and how you can intimidate them in order to achieve some kind of stability in Paktia. That seems to me the only way that I could really understand progress. In other words, a very local political process. Does it guarantee stability? No. Are we going to have to talk probably more about containing and managing the situation than we have in the past? Probably yes. Am I talking about abandoning the South? No, not entirely, because I think, and that's why I said 90% agreed with Alan, I think it would be very dangerous to actually actively punish the push-to areas. I don't think what you should be doing is saying, there's insecurity here, therefore you're not going to get anything. I think what you should be talking about is a more equitable distribution. You should be saying, we're not going to punish you at all, but we just recognize that there are about half the population live in Hazara, Tajik, Uzbek areas, and we're going to be giving as many resources to them in development aid as we're giving to you. If the result is from that the insecurity and instability in the pushing areas is so extreme that you see very little for that, whereas those central and northern areas benefit and flourish, so be it. And I think there is an implicit lesson in that for those areas in the south and the east. But I certainly wouldn't be presenting it as a punishment regime.
So one last thing from me, the scenario you're developing for us, it absolutely necessitates the building of a constructive dialogue engagement with areas of the country that are under Taliban control. In other words, working with the Taliban.
Yeah. A central part of any hope for any kind of stability in the south and east of Afghanistan is that the Afghan government itself, not foreign military, not the CIA, but the Afghan government itself, should engage in a serious process of identifying who matters in those regions and cutting deals with them. And that will, of course, involve dealing with many people who have been fighting with the Taliban, many people who we may have described as drug lords, warlords, human rights abusers. And it will involve an enormous amount of political courage in which the leader of Afghanistan will have to make difficult decisions. Am I prepared to deal with this person or aren't I? If I'm not prepared to deal with this person, what can I do about them? How am I going to exclude them? How am I going to marginalize them? Who am I going to put in their place? But we've approached it so far in a very dilettantish fashion. I mean, if you look at Helmand, essentially what happens is we turn up, and Karzai had a kind of answer. So he said, well, look, there's this guy called Sher Mohammad Akhundzadeh. His dad was a jihadi commander. He's a sort of jihadi commander. His family's relatively prestigious and powerful in this area. He's now the governor of the province. We said, admittedly, this is not, because we were crazy. Quite accurately, we said, this man is a drug lord, a warlord, and a human rights abuser. This man is massively corrupt. The population of Helmand don't like him. They feel intimidated by him. One of the reasons they don't like your government, Karzai, is you've got people like this as governor. Right? So all that's true. We then added to that, and furthermore, his power is power that we have given him. Right? He wouldn't be there as governor. He's a paper tiger in this sense. We created him. We gave him the cash. We gave him the guns that gave him that kind of power. We concluded on that basis, therefore, that he should be removed and replaced by who? Replaced by Engineer Daud, an English-speaking technocrat who'd run a non-profit and was based in Kabul, and who turned up and took over the province and tried very nobly to leave his office over the next 9 months. He was then replaced again by an elderly tribal figure with relations on the Pakistani-Afghan border, who, again, we found it very difficult to deal with. And now people are talking again about bringing back Sher Mohammad Akhundzadeh. So the thing I'm raising here is not that I'm trying to endorse Sher Mohammad Akhundzadeh, who I think is a horrendous man, but I'm trying to enjoin on the international community some kind of empathy for what Karzai is dealing with here, which is it's not sufficient for us to read a Human Rights Watch report and say, this man is bad. I would like to see where is the replacement, right? Who is going to fill this vacuum? It doesn't matter that we have created this man. We've given him the money and the guns. We may have created him, but he can still be powerful. Right? Your power over your 25-year-old grandson is no greater from the fact that in some sense you created him. Right? Anyway, this is it.
That's enough from me. Let's throw it open to the floor. I'm sure there is a microphone here. I'm sure a lot of you have questions or observations or points to make. Please, come on. Yeah, there you go. One here and then one down here.
I have a bit of a question about the different groups we see operating in Afghanistan, and that people, often in the media, the word Taliban is used as sort of a catch-all phrase, when really you have local anti-government Pashtun groups like what you see under Hekmatyar, you have the Pakistan Taliban with Baitullah Masood, and people like that. You have the Haqqani network, and then you have, groups that are more focused on Pakistan itself. So when you're looking at all these groups together, and people use the word Taliban as well as Al-Qaeda as if that's somehow these two groups are the only ones that matter. My question is, given this diversity and this dynamic, when you look at actual core Al-Qaeda operatives, foreign fighters based out of the tribal areas, is that presence growing at all in Afghanistan? Because we hear rumors of sort of the increasing Al-Qaedization of the eastern insurgency and things like that. So I'm wondering about the actual weight of these different groups in Afghanistan.
Okay, so this is an unbelievably sophisticated question, right? And I don't know the answer to this question. And what you can see there already is somebody who, as a questioner, is already pushing the limits of our knowledge. I mean, even distinguishing between Baitullah Masood, Hekmatyar, Mullah Muhammad Omar, or, as the questioner implies, even the very basic distinction between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda seems to actually evade us. I would not be surprised if Hillary Clinton would have difficulty remembering those names. Right? I mean, this is not to be rude about Hillary Clinton, but simply that it's not likely that she, who has to deal with Somalia one day, Palestine the next, Afghanistan the next, she deal with those names. I would not be surprised if actually the publics listening to that kind of conversation would not get somewhat depressed, that if you were a kind of punter sitting in the audience listening to that, you'd be like, wait a second, the Taliban is fragmented? I mean, what are we supposed to do? It's like catching an eel, right? I mean, how are we supposed to negotiate with them? Now you're telling me there are 4 different groups in the Taliban, and then you're asking me, is it or is it not true that Al-Qaeda is growing in South Afghanistan? I actually don't believe that the CIA knows the answer to that question. And one of our issues here is a question of what it is we're trying to achieve, of course. Right? Is it or is it not valid to distinguish between, broadly speaking, Al-Qaeda, who I suppose we parse as a kind of international terrorist group dedicated to attacks against the West, Europe and the United States, associated with 9/11, and the Taliban, who maybe you would want to characterize as some kind of traditional conservative Afghan group, who are really only interested in imposing their repressive social codes on Afghanistan and don't really care about attacking the Twin Towers. Is that a valid distinction? I mean, of course, it's not an exact distinction. There's clearly a relationship between those two groups, and quite clearly over the last 7 years, those relationships have become much stronger. But is it a useful distinction? Is it someone can we work with? If for some reason you could distinguish between those two groups in a reasonable enough way, would we be prepared to accept, or would the United States be prepared to accept, a Taliban government, provided that Taliban government did not provide safe haven to people who wanted to attack the United States? Do we care? And what are our priorities here? Are we, like the Canadian Parliament, concerned with the treatment of Afghan women in southern Afghanistan? Or are we concerned with international terrorist attacks against the United States? And secondly, if we were, for the sake of argument, and I suspect the American administration is primarily concerned about international terrorist attacks against the United States, to what extent does it matter whether or not Al-Qaeda are able to operate in Afghanistan? To what extent are Quantico-style training camps an important part of their ability to launch attacks against the United States? To what extent does it matter to them whether they're in Afghanistan or Pakistan? I mean, we appear to have been relatively successful, as far as we can tell, in ensuring that Osama bin Laden does not find Afghanistan a comfortable place to locate himself at the moment. Not comfortable because there are sufficient predators, special forces, intelligence operatives to continue to make Afghanistan itself not a very comfortable place to set up your camp. But on the other hand, you seem to be able to sit in a range of different houses in Pakistan and do pretty much what you used to do from large guerrilla-style camps, and the reason for that, of course, is that those guerrilla-style camps were presumably largely developed, and now I'm straying outside my territory, but presumably, I guess, largely developed to fight a jihad. In other words, you had a big Quantico-style camp because you were training people in infantry maneuvers. You were training them on attacking a Russian tank. But if your objective is just to teach people how to do 9/11, then you've only got to teach them 2 things. You've got to teach them how to do some kung fu with a box cutter, and you've got to teach them how to fly an airplane, neither of which things you need a camp to do. In fact, you teach them to fly an airplane by sending them to Florida, and you can teach them how to use a box cutter in a safe house in northern England. So that is to say, in relation to the question, I don't know the answer to your question. I barely begin to understand what's happening with the Taliban. I'm not even sure. I mean, Peter Marsden's written a very good book on the Taliban, has much more sophisticated understanding of the Taliban than I do, but I'm not sure he can actually answer that question either. And I think understanding those limits of our knowledge is quite important in understanding why we are in a muddle.
Since you've still got the microphone there, since you do ask a question that presses the frontiers of our knowledge, do you have any observations of this of your own to add to Rory?
In terms of solution to Afghanistan, or what's likely?
No, just in terms of the two questions you raise, the fragmentation of the Taliban and the Al-Qaedization, as you put it.
I mean, I think what's happening with the Taliban right now in 2009 is that it's likely to happen in the year ahead is that it's growing increasingly fragmented, increasingly criminalized, and increasingly involved in the narcotics trade in a lot of areas, which doesn't bode well for efforts to negotiate with, the quote-unquote moderate Taliban or any of these other actors you're talking about. In terms of the camps and the training camps on the border, I sort of question the assertion of how comfortable those camps are for al-Qaeda operatives, given that a lot of these tribal issues cross right over the border into Pakistan, and those aren't usually very good operating environments, because if you're there as a foreign fighter, you want to know that you have this safe haven to carry out an operation, but if you're staying with this person, automatically the person down the road becomes your enemy. So I don't honestly believe that the camps in Pakistan are sort of the site of the next 9/11 as much as people play it up to be.
Great, thank you very much. Let's get a question from down here. Somebody had their hand up. Yes. You might want to introduce yourself. You don't have to, if you want to tell us who you are.
Malcolm Deal Job. Rory, it appears, and would you agree with this, that the situation that we have with American and British forces in Afghanistan is a bit like trying to put out a fire by piling more wood onto it. The Taliban will just grow. They do, and the numbers of Taliban we claim to have killed is just astounding, and they're still there. And that, would you agree that one of the solutions perhaps is to have key leader engagement with long-term British and American military or intelligence service personnel who are prepared to stay there longer than 6 months? A British tour is 6 months long, and in that tour, apart from the ground and troops, we don't spend a huge amount of time in one area, gaining a bit of rapport with the locals, and we move around quite a lot. What we had with the British Empire, whether agreed or not, was people who lived out, governors who lived out there for 40 years. And that seemed to be successful, depending on how you define success, but it was successful in that there was a lot of key leader engagement in a local area. Individuals won't spend more than 6 months in one area, even the brigadier, and he governs the whole of Helmand Province or British forces there.
Okay, so I think in answer to this question, there are three different elements there. And this is an interesting analogy. It's an analogy being drawn with the imperial situation, British Empire. And there are three elements, and they are these. Right, the first question is, I'm sorry that I keep popping up and down, but first question is this. Would we be able to find these people? Would we be able to find our Cesar Borgias? Would we be able to find these ideal, charismatic military or civil officers who would be able to penetrate local society, develop the instincts to deal with it in order to achieve our objectives? Second question, would our own home societies be comfortable with that? Would we be prepared to support them? Would we give them the financial flexibility? Would we give them, Lawrence of Arabia, to give you an analogy, in 1917 spent what in today's terms would be the equivalent of about £400 million in gold on buying the allegiances of the Arab tribes. I guess probably if you gave me £400 million in gold, I might be able to do something. But are you going to give it to me? Right? Are you going to let a 28-year-old rock around on a camel with £400 million in order to buy some tribal sheikhs? Lawrence did it in a very interesting way, which opens some questions for the National Audit Office. Lawrence worked out that a much better way of giving people, he thought you should give people about maximum of £400 each. So his £400 in 1917 money, and the 400 million figure I've quoted is in today's figures, so I'm confusing you slightly with figures, but £400 in 1917 money. So he worked out the best way of doing it was to open the bag of gold and let them stick their hand in. And he said to them, take as much as you can take. And he said they could rarely take with their hand more than 280 or 320 pounds. But they felt much better about it than if he'd counted out 400 to them. Right? So second question, would we support them? Would we give them the wherewithal to do this? Would we be comfortable with the idea that we had bearded colonial officers riding around handing out golds? Third question is, which I think is the most important question, is would Afghans put up with it? Right? My answer to almost all these questions is no. Right? We don't have these people. What we have approaching these people are not 19th century adventurers. They are the products of British universities. They're products of contemporary Britain. They are soldiers, they're development workers, they're diplomats, and we're asking them to have the skills of a 1920s Chicago ward politician. We're asking them to cajole, manipulate, bribe. Now, there are certain people, I think, in the Pakistani Internet Services Intelligence Agency who are able to perform in that role. I'm not certain how many Britons can do it. But the questioner was absolutely right. I mean, one of the constraints on this is simply the time in which we deploy. I mean, I was talking to a British general, and I said to him, why is it you're only on 6-month tours? This was in Kabul at dinner, and General Rich says to him, why are you only on 6-month tours? And he said, well, that'd be ridiculous. I mean, we're having serious recruitment problems into the army at the moment. I see my wife and children once in 6 months. My wife's going to divorce me anyway, and she's going to divorce me much more if it was ever more than 6 months. 6 months is the absolute maximum. The Italians only do 4 months, right? So I said, well, how come the Americans are doing 15 months? And he said, well, the Americans think they're fighting a war, don't they? Right? I mean, if the Nazis were at Calais, I might be prepared to do 15 months, but I'm not going to do 15 months here in Afghanistan. Now, that suddenly revealed something quite important about what's going on in this country, and reveals why actually, unfortunately, we are, while pretending that we are somehow solidifying a special relationship through our participation in these adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, we are in fact destroying it. We are in fact discrediting ourselves. The American military is increasingly impatient and contemptuous. If you were to read a thriller such as Tom Clancy's Patriot Games in the mid-1980s, you would discover that there was a popular consciousness in the United States that the British were really tough and really hard, and the British Army were about as good as they got. And the SAS appear again and again in thrillers throughout the 1980s and 1990s. My prediction is, in 10 years' time, there's not a single British soldier, officer, or SAS officer who's going to appear in any kind of American thriller. They have concluded that we are but one step away from our NATO colleagues, the Italians. The conclusion, therefore, and this is extremely unfair to those of you who've been in the British Army, and I am extremely sorry, and I apologize, but the point that I'm making is this, that despite all the sacrifice and all the courage of our soldiers, there is a problem. The Americans have, above all, more money, more kit. We are perpetually calling on their aid. Every time we're in trouble, we're having to bring in. When I was in Nasiriyah, stuck in my compound under siege, 120 mortars, rocket-propelled grenades coming in, all I could do was call on an American AC-130 Spectre gunship and $150 million worth of aeroplane with Gatling guns, 30 millimeters, firing from 10,000 feet, arrived and bailed me out. And that is what we're asking them to do again and again. We're operating at a division size, but we're totally dependent on American support, and this isn't doing our reputation any good. But the final thing, right, which I'm coming on to, is would the Afghans put up with it? And the answer is no, because in fact, the difference between the situation in which we were in the 19th century, where, in fact, to be honest, the Afghans didn't really put up with it so much either, but the difference we were in the 19th century, at least in British India, or in the 19th century in Africa, and even to some extent in the 19th century in the Middle East, where it was possible for the British to try to occupy these kinds of roles, where it's possible for somebody like me to arrive and say, hello, I'm the district officer in this province, I'm the magistrate as well, I'm the collector of land revenue, I have 3 sepoys with me, and I will be taking your tax money and providing some good justice, is no longer possible because the forces of anti-colonialism, of Islam, of nationalism, have made people somewhat intolerant of this situation, a situation which, of course, we have contributed to through some canny propaganda investment in the 1980s, where we set out, in order to fight the Soviet Union, to convince almost every Afghan villager that we could access that it was important to fight to the death for the spirit of the Battle of Maiwand, for nationalism and for Islam against foreign military occupation. So thank you for the question.
Yes.
Mick Charkey, filmmaker. How realistic are the non-military solutions? I'm thinking of employment. I'm thinking of the problem of poverty and the anger it can produce. Could some of the money, for example, the cost of 17,000 troops, be put to building infrastructure, above all, giving jobs, well-monitored jobs, to the indigenous population?
So this is a great question, and the answer is we're really not sure. I mean, we want to believe that with more money we have something called international development, that we understand how to do international development, that somehow if we had the money we would be able to create good jobs and more prosperous Afghanistan. It's not that clear, actually, that we really know how to do that. We've spent $700 trillion since the Second World War on international development, and Ghana, which had a GDP per capita of £800 in 1957, when the GDP per capita of Britain was £1,700, now has a GDP per capita of about $450, when the GDP per capita of Britain is about $25,000, $30,000, right? So it's not quite clear that we necessarily have the wherewithal, I mean, globally, to do this kind of thing. I think there's certainly evidence that in Afghanistan there are certain kinds of projects which have been more productive than others. I talked briefly about the National Solidarity Program. Those of you who are familiar with it, essentially what happens is that the World Bank has given $400 million to the Afghan government. The Afghan government then filters the money through to local NGOs. $20,000 is given to a village council, an elected village council, in front of the villagers. I'm the village chief, I get the money in front of all of you, and I spend it on something for the village. Do I steal the money? Not likely, because you've just seen me get the money. If I try to steal the money, you lynch me, right? And I spend it on what I believe the priorities of the village happen to be, which might be an irrigation project, might be a tractor, might be a generator. Is it going to create sustainable development? Probably not. Are the projects that I choose the kind of projects that would be chosen by a development economist? Probably not. Am I saving a great deal of money by not having too many foreign white land cruisers involved and too many World Bank consultants involved? Last year, out of $3.5 billion spent in Afghanistan, we spent $1.3 billion on consultants. Am I spending money in those? Am I saving money in those ways? Yes, of course I'm saving money in those ways, and I'm probably dealing with villagers who have a better idea of what their priorities are and may be more willing to sustain the project in the future. So there are certainly many things like that we can do. I've been working in the old city of Kabul, and maybe this is a better place to begin than my kind of ridiculous rants on international politics and British foreign policy. 3 years I've been working in the old city of Kabul. It's a relatively straightforward project. We've taken over 2 or 3 city blocks of what used to be the historic commercial center of the city with craft schools. We began by talking to the community and getting a petition from 52 householders asking us to come in and work in the area. We cleared 15,000 trucks of garbage, dropping the street level by about 7 feet and creating near total employment for every unemployed male in that part of the city. We've restored 62 buildings. We've set up a clinic. The community came to us and said they wanted a primary school. I said, we don't do primary schools. They said, you better do a primary school. I did a primary school, right? And the primary school is probably the best bit of the project. Not that I could see it, but the community could see it. They liked it. 160 children, girls and boys, turned up within about an hour, but it's not simple. The fathers insisted on sitting at the back of the classroom because they didn't trust what we were teaching their daughters. We had to bring a teacher from an urban charter school in Boston in order to work on curriculum development, teacher training. We sacked teachers 3 times over before we got anybody who could actually teach properly. I mean, this is the problem with the notion of just building 5,000 schools. Quality is very difficult to achieve. But it's now a good primary school, and it's one that I'd be very proud to show anybody. And in addition, we have an institute for traditional Afghan arts, which trains women and men in ceramics, woodwork, calligraphy, miniature painting. I've just this morning went to the Connaught Hotel, where we've just done a wooden suite this size. We charged the Connaught $125,000. It was all made in Afghanistan by Afghan craftsmen with Afghan wood. We've just built a library in Japan. These are jobs and incomes which, if we work smartly enough on understanding international markets, may be sustainable. But it's a very small project, right? I've got 350 employees. I'm working on 3 city blocks. And this year we will spend over $7 million. Do I believe that that community in 20 years' time will be more prosperous? That the area will be more humane and more stable than it is today? Yes. Do I believe that's replicable across the whole country? No, not really. Because the level of investment, the level of knowledge we need, the level of community relations we need, it's not credible that you could replicate NSC. So I would probably put money into more things like the National Solidarity Program. But maybe I haven't answered your question. Sorry.
Well, I'm just thinking, a lot in the Middle East, that that there is an enormous discrepancy between nationalism, Islam, and everything that goes with it, and give us a job. And that's way up the top. And wherever you're in a poor, poor country, what they want most is a job. It's not fighting for Islam. It's not even fighting for nationhood. It's give us a job. And I'd have thought there could be a way, and I'm not thinking of wonderful, wonderful Turquoise Mountain craft schemes, but maybe bigger things, commercial industry, things that could really build for the country.
I mean, I agree. I mean, it's absolutely true. Most Afghans you speak to are pretty cross, and largely they're cross because, you know, I had exactly this experience. I went to talk to the man who, well, he's our cook, right? I sat down with him and I said, how's everything going? And he said, it's rubbish. And I said, why is it rubbish? And he said, look, I'm the only person in my family who works. I'm 67 years old. I'm supporting 20 people. This is ridiculous, right? And so, of course, yes, we want to create jobs. The problem is, I'm not sure we know how to do that. I mean, China has just lost 20 million jobs in the last 4 months. The United States is on its way to losing 10 million jobs. We can certainly simply dispense cash. I mean, we can create work. We can pay people to dig holes and fill them in again, or we can pay people to clear garbage, right? But to set up serious productive industries in Afghanistan, sustainable economic growth that could compete with China and India, to be able to provide alternative livelihoods which begin to compete with poppy, to be able to overcome the fact that Afghanistan doesn't have a seaport, that it has the most crazy government, that there's no security, that the road network barely exists. In other words, to actually generate what you'd probably want, which is what Pakistan had 2 years ago, which is 6 or 7% annual economic growth a year in order to try to pull people into the job market, that I don't think any development economist could pretend that they could achieve however much money you threw at them. But maybe I'm wrong.
Yes, going back to your opening remarks about the tendency to blame the current situation in Afghanistan on the massive diversion of resources in Iraq. If those resources had stayed in Afghanistan, do you think there might not have been a resurgent Taliban, or would it have happened anyway in some way?
My personal view was that Brahimi was correct. I mean, the reason why Brahimi, the UN boss in 2002, said, keep a light footprint, is he was an Algerian. He had seen the French colonial forces in action. He believed Afghanistan was a country where it was very easy to ignite an insurgency. He thought that if you tried to put UN officers and foreign troops in every part of the country, you would have a massive insurgency flaring up in your face. His argument at that stage, he's changed slightly now, was that 20,000 troops was correct not in developmental terms but politically. And my guess is you would have had all the problems we've seen in Iraq just more rapidly if you tried to do what we did in Iraq, which is bring in over 140,000 troops. I lived through that in Iraq. Afghanistan was saved, really, I believe, from 2001 to 2005 because we didn't try to do too much, because we didn't spend too much money. I believe that it is not a coincidence that the resurgence of the Taliban has come about at exactly the same time as we've begun pumping up the troops and the money. Now, this is something that people hate hearing, and I can't prove it. Right? I mean, people say, no, it's just a coincidence. The Taliban were on their way back, and we just didn't bring in enough troops. I think it's a pretty uncanny coincidence that my friend Anthony Fitzherbert was able to travel around Helmand safely throughout 2003, 2004, 2005, until they started building the British troop base. I don't think it's implausible that one of the major elements of success in the Taliban strategy, and certainly one of the major elements in their propaganda, has been this government are slaves of the infidel, and we are fighting a jihad against a foreign military occupation. And I am disgusted, now this is where I get angry, with the international community, the think tanks, the journalists, who persist in becoming obsessed with those bits of Taliban propaganda, which I think are relatively minor, which say the problem is corruption in the government and the problem is civilian casualties from bombardment. The reason, of course, we get obsessed with those things is because we can imagine we can do something about those things, right? We somehow imagine we can just tell the United States to stop killing civilians with bombardment and we can get rid of corruption in the Afghan government and then the Taliban are going to like us. And of course, the reason we presumably don't talk about all this stuff about jihad and resistance to foreign military occupation is it's not quite clear what we'd do if it turned out the problem was not what we did, but who we were. So my belief is light footprint was correct. And thank goodness from Iraq, if what Iraq did was prevent us from doing this in 2002.
But a development footprint rather than a military footprint would have made a heavy development footprint.
Again, I mean, I don't want to sound like a boring development economist, but there's an absorption problem. Right? It's very, very difficult. I mean, we've spent $4 billion in Afghanistan last year, and in 2008 we committed $20 billion. The Paris conference, which is going to bring it up to $5 billion a year. DFID is going to spend nearly $1 billion a year. How on earth does a country like Afghanistan absorb that? Now, how can you put it through the central government? The development budget of the government of Afghanistan was underspent by 70% on average over the last 4 years. The municipality of Kabul has had a $220 million Kabul urban upgrading project from the World Bank sitting in its funds for 3 years now. They simply cannot begin to comply with the most basic donor requirements on tendering, contracting, or quality. You can't, in a country like that, just unleash the floodgates of cash. And if you do, basically all that happens is everybody steals the money. It doesn't end up creating any serious development.
Good evening. I very much appreciate your points about the levels of essentially waste and mismanagement in Afghanistan. I think that that's perfectly accurate. I wouldn't necessarily agree that the light footprint is the solution. I agree that too much has been done in too short a time, or too much has been attempted to be done in too short a time, and been done poorly. And everywhere that you look, you actually see something that's been wasted or mismanaged or neglected that could have been done better, whether it's the police or the judiciary or really any of the most fundamental elements of rebuilding Afghanistan. I think that as you acknowledged, for example, most civil servants in Afghanistan barely have a high school education. So the failure of the light footprint in a lot of ways was the assumption that the Afghan government could be rebuilt and restructured in such a way that the international community would provide some sort of light support and Afghans would be able to do it themselves. This patently has proved to be untrue. That capacity doesn't exist. But it was unrealistic to expect that by pouring in a few billion more dollars, without that kind of necessary institution building with the long-term approach, that you'd have the kind of sort of legitimacy for government institutions that you needed. The other thing that I would ask is, I think I would probably agree that you need to do less in Afghanistan and do it well, but would you accept, for example, that if you scale back quite severely the international military presence in Afghanistan and you leave the Afghan government, which by all accounts is not really credible in most parts of the country, that you're running the risk of sliding back into civil war?
It's a very good comment. I mean, it's a well-observed comment. It's true, of course. If you scale back the number of troops, the risk of violence increases. The risk, as Alan pointed out, that you would lose control of Sangin, Goresh, Musa Kala, Lashkar increases. The risk of civil war, don't know, depends what you mean by a civil war. I mean, do I think that with a lighter footprint you would be able to stop the Taliban from rolling artillery and tanks up the main road to Kabul? Yes. Do I think you would be able to prevent a re-emergence, the kind of civil war we saw in Kabul in '93 with far fewer troops? Yes. Do I think you'd be able to prevent the kind of neighborhood killing that you saw in Baghdad? No. And there is that kind of risk. But I suppose, without being kind of overly gloomy about this, we have to match our ambitions to our resources. I mean, if I'm right that it's not plausible that in 5 years' time our populations, our ministries of finance are going to put up with us having 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, then it doesn't really matter whether or not withdrawing is going to increase the amount of violence. We're just going to have to work out what we do with less, almost regardless of what's ideal. I mean, I think there's one of the problems with the Obama administration at the moment is they're still stuck in this yes we can thing, right, where they seem to think what they need to do is define the ideal and then find the resources to match it. Whereas, of course, I'm coming from the other direction. I'm saying, ought implies can, you don't have a moral obligation to do what you can't do, right? So let's look realistically at what sort of resources we're likely to be able to deploy and then design a strategy around that. Your question on capacity, though, is a difficult one. I mean, honestly, where in the world have you seen the international community go into a country where more than half the civil servants don't have a high school education, and somehow, in and of itself, the international community sorts that out, eliminates corruption, educates everybody, makes the Afghan government a functioning thing? How long does that take? What does it cost? How do you do it? I mean, what I see instead is that we've identified a problem, but we don't have a solution. And let me give you an example. We've identified that there's corruption in Afghanistan. We're very worried about this. We know corruption is a big problem. And yet I was in a room in the Serena, and the World Bank and the American government are now running anti-corruption programs. So the World Bank and the American government had, I think, cumulatively about $300 million in anti-corruption. Standing up here, and this is, I suppose, sort of almost where I should be ending, because I know you need to get off, but sitting up here is a Chicago University law professor who, with his colleague, is costing the US government $1.5 million over a year by the time you've factored in their close protection, their armored vehicles, their accommodation, and their salary. And his task is to lead the governance program, right? Because every problem we identify, we have a program to address. It's a problem with corruption, so we have an anti-corruption program. It's a problem with rule of law, we have a rule of law program. It's a problem with state building, we have a state building program. It's a problem with counter-narcotics. The British government has set up its counter-narcotics program. What does it look like, though? How do you eliminate corruption? Well, the answer seems to be, as far as I could observe, and he's a friend of mine, and you know, you're welcome to talk to him, right? He's called Daniel Rothenberg, right? And he's happy to answer questions on this issue. He stands up in front of you, and I walk into the room. It's the Serena Hotel, and sitting in front of me are about 250 of the most corrupt men in Afghanistan. And they're sitting there with their fantastic Rolex watches on their wrist, with their conference pens and conference paper, and he's doing a PowerPoint presentation in which he's saying to them, the way to eliminate corruption is through transparent, predictable, and accountable financial processes. Right? And everybody in the audience is nodding, and they're saying, that's right, transparent, predictable, and accountable financial processes. Right? The problem there, right, is not a problem of technical transfer of knowledge. Right? It's not a thing which the West is very well equipped to do. We could plausibly go into a situation and say, if you'd like to build a road, we have a road engineer. If you'd like to build a dam, we have a dam builder. If you'd like to train in how to make ceramics, we have somebody who can build a better kiln, who can increase the temperature, who can make the glaze adhere to the body of the clay, and who can eliminate the lead content in the glaze, right? That's something you might be able to do. But to imagine that you can go into somebody else's country and eliminate corruption in that fashion, I think is slightly implausible. And in that lies my concluding statement, if it is indeed my concluding statement, right? In that lies my concluding statement, that the key to Afghanistan's future is distinguishing between those things that we can do as internationals and those things we can't. Now, that doesn't mean that the things we can't do aren't important. They're vital. Right? They go to the very depth of the viability of the country. They include the ability to deal with the Taliban, the ability to deal with narcotics, the ability to eliminate corruption, the ability to build a state. But this is not the business of the international community, because we don't know how to do it, and when we try to do it, we discredit it ourselves, alienate people, and waste our money. The people who need to do that, in the end, are Afghans. And the best that we can do is to try to work out how on earth you create the political space for that Afghan Ataturk to emerge. How on earth you create the political space for Afghans to take the lead and develop that narrative of national identity. And that's where I think we fall down again and again, because our tendency is to behave like a frustrated colonial power, to micromanage, to interfere, to refuse to delegate, to not really allow that process to happen because we don't like what we see happening on the ground. And unless we learn to show restraint, unless we distance ourselves, unless we learn a lesson which is fundamentally a lesson about humility, we're likely to fail. Thank you all very much indeed.
Rory, thank you very much indeed. I come to a lot of these things at the Frontline Club. They're always a joy, but very few of them are as keenly as observed and as courageously concluded as yours. So thank you very much indeed. Once more, please, Rory Stewart.